Welcome to the Society of Professional Journalists talk on political extremism in the United States with John Avlon.
Hey.
My name is Bansari Kamdar. I'm an independent reporter in Boston, Massachusetts. I usually write on gender, immigration, political economy. I also work in research and communications at UMass Boston's Castellan Institute for Latino Community Development and Public Policy and Harvard University's Center for International Development. I am really honored to introduce our guest tonight. If you watch CNN, you're familiar with the face. John Avlon is the senior political analyst and anchor at CNN, and he's also the past managing director and editor-in-chief at the Daily Beast.
Yes.
Editor-in-chief at the Daily Beast. He has also written several books and some really amazing essays. I think I still remember your essay on New York after 9/11. It's one of the most touching essays I've read. So among the books that he's written, it's Independent Nation, Washington's Farewell, and Wingnuts, How the Lunatic Fringe is Hijacking America, which is going to fit right into our discussion for today. John, thank you for joining us once again.
Of course, my pleasure. Wingnuts is 10 years old at this point, but it seems still pretty timely.
It does. In many ways, I feel like I think it's a little more than a decade now, but in many ways it does foreshadow what we see right now with this rise of this political fringe in America. And I was wondering if you could expand on this idea of wingnuts and how that relates to the politics of our time.
Sure. Well, I got the idea for writing Wingnuts. It came out of my reporting in the early months and really first year of the Obama administration. Tina Brown had just started the Daily Beast, and she hired me to be a columnist. I would later succeed her, but that was a long way away at that time. And I got really interested in an election that, had been, people were feeling pretty good about. Both Obama and McCain both campaigned against polarization and hyperpartisanship. Sarah Palin, not so much, but it was an election that people were feeling pretty good about, and there was obviously a historic first. And I started to notice sort of a reflexive resistance, particularly online, to Obama's election that seemed right out of stuff I'd seen in resistance to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, things that were expressed in a book called Paranoid Style in American Politics by Richard Hofstadter, which is kind of a classic, although it's a bit dated. And so I started covering this movement. I may have some kind of a beeping thing, and I'm not quite sure what to do about that. So we're just gonna
all right. Continue.
In any case, I started, doing some early stories, going to early protest rallies that became the Tea Party movement, and chronicling these people making these like really over the top claims about Obama and what his election meant. And some of them, I remember one of them, there was an ad that called for massive resistance. And whether they knew it or not, that was explicitly the language used by the white citizens councils in the 1960s in reaction to Brown v. Board and desegregation orders. And in my interviews with people at the rallies and interviewing people and these include, some of the first interviews with Stuart Rhodes, the founder of the Oath Keepers, who's now very much in the news now around the attack on the Capitol, founder of the Three Percenters, militia groups, as well as just average protesters. I tried to do a couple things: get a sense of the zeitgeist, interview people, and get a sense of what they were thinking, whether they were famous or just folks at protests. And I tried hard to not dehumanize them, to try to understand where they were coming from. And that was a technique I'll get into later, but there's a great column by Murray Kempton called The Southern Gentleman that does that brilliantly. And then I also tried to show kind of the historical antecedents. So, and this is the kind of the most interesting thing for me, and the kind of writing and reporting I try to do as a reported columnist and writing reality checks on CNN is it's always more interesting for me to say this happened and add the context, add the perspective. So, Glenn Beck was hugely powerful and popular at that particular moment. But it seemed to me that you could only make sense of Glenn Beck to the extent you could make sense of Glenn Beck if you understood like the John Birch Society. And if you understood the rhetoric from the John Birch Society, it all flowed up. And indeed, that was true with a lot of these militia groups that now have crested 10 years later. They had antecedents. And if you could trace them, you could, not make sense of them is overstating it, but it becomes really important to understanding what they're tapping into, even if it's only semi-conscious. And I think what we've seen over the last few years is obviously with the election of Donald Trump, which I did not anticipate at all, mainlining that movement in American politics and bringing conspiracy theories into the Oval Office and ultimately leading to an attack on the Capitol.
That cues in right into what I wanted to ask next about. So I think one of the things you write about in the book is this idea of patriots, which I thought was a very interesting concept. And it was a word that stuck to me over time. And I was wondering if you could expand on that and also talk about this sort of relationship, to put it very broadly, between partisanship and this form of patriotism.
Well, so the term hatriot is something I came up with as a riff off of the term patriot, which is obviously not the classical term patriot. I consider myself a patriot, but the patriot movement. And the patriot movement is best understood. It starts to get a lot of energy on the far right, particularly again in reaction to Brown v. Board in the context of the Cold War, people who were stridently, some would say, paranoidically anti-communist. So, I mean, Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, famously accused President Eisenhower, of all people, of being a secret Soviet agent. And it ties into all this sort of idea of a one world government conspiracy and the deep state and stuff you see traces of to this day. But the militia movement, self-described, comes out of a lot of different groups like the Sovereign Citizens Movement and Posse Comitatus, that themselves are, reactions to not just the civil rights movement, but in some cases trying to relitigate constitutional amendments after the Civil War. And what's sometimes referred to as a Christian nationalist movement, although I think people misunderstand that today. And as a Christian, it's not about Christianity. It's about a sort of weaponization of faith within a right-wing ideology that tends towards violence. At least it's the paranoid style. And then, that crested, in the early 90s, there was a lot of momentum on the far right around this, incidents like Ruby Ridge and Waco, and then the destruction of the Murrah Federal Building by Timothy McVeigh sort of burst that bubble, as it were. And Merrick Garland, actually the new attorney general, or soon to be attorney general, prosecuted that case. And I did a reality check the other day looking at his role in Oklahoma City and then the relevance of McVeigh and the militia movement to what we're seeing today. Because the number of militias grew enormously during Obama, and that's what I chronicled in the Hatriot chapter. But it didn't go down when Trump was president. They thought they had, some of them thought they had an avatar in the Oval Office.
So this is going to be, again, like a slightly more broader question, but when does this sort of like fringe politics, political extremism turn into violence? Because what we see with the January 6th is sort of like the siege on the US Capitol and sort of moving away from just rhetoric to action. And when does that happen? If you can give us like historical context on it.
Sure. That's one of the most difficult questions, both to characterize and to put in a bottle, because obviously we have free speech in the United States, and incitement is a difficult thing to prove, although certainly the 14th Amendment mentions insurrection rather specifically. This is something the founders worried about. Obviously, one of the things we try to do is, if you have a sense of historic perspective or you've been following a story closely, is to wave your hands and say, this could be something. This could be dangerous. This could be a problem down the road. And sometimes what you're covering, the folks involved may not actually see or have a full sense of the historic precedent they're drawing on. In some cases they do, like Dylann Roof. In some cases they don't. But the attack on the Capitol is a very clear example of, ideas can turn into actions, particularly if they're incited by powerful people. And, our Capitol's never been attacked. I mean, since the War of 1812. It was quite possibly targeted on 9/11. But to see US democracy come under assault because of a big lie about a president refusing to accept the results of an election, and then his supporters taking it literally and seriously, and attacking the Capitol is a disgraceful moment for our democracy, but it speaks to the danger of this kind of playing footsie with fanatics. This is not what politics is supposed to be, but it really ties into the larger theme of much of my work, which is combating hyperpartisanship and polarization. For a long time, going back to my first book, I've been warning that this is dangerous stuff, that it doesn't actually represent the founders' wisdom at all, even though some folks who try to draw on this try to pretend they're, pure, quote unquote, real Americans and representing the founders. In fact, they're doing the exact opposite of what the founders, Washington in particular, would have wanted. So, it is an indelible example. And it's going to be one of those things that gets worse the more we learn about it. And there's still unanswered questions, although we saw the basic facts unfold in front of our eyes. It's going to look worse in the eyes of history. This is going to be regarded as a real low moment in our democracy, and it's going to be something we need to reckon with. And the fact that already there's self-protective lies being pushed by people in power itself is sort of stunning. And that just indicates how much part of our job as journalists is to combat disinformation. It is not partisan. It is about truth versus lies. And if that falls a certain way in any given time, so be it.
You make complete sense. I agree with you on that. So you worked on both sides of the coin, right? You worked as a speechwriter for Rudy Giuliani in politics, and then also worked as a columnist. And you also write in your book about this sort of like polarizing for profit by the media. And I was wondering, what role has media played in the hyperpartisanship that you mention and we see today?
Sure. So, first of all, I think ideally, and I'll just speak for myself, but anyway, I think ideally people should be drawn to journalism and public service for some of the same reasons, right? Because you care about the country, because you want to engage in civic debate, because you want to discuss policy, you want to, chronicle our times, you want to get involved as a citizen in the story of our times, and ideally it's two sides of the same coin. Obviously, they are in tension. That's the way the system was designed, and just inevitably is. And there is a long history of political figures who've been both journalists and involved in politics. I think we sometimes pretend that, those lines are never crossed. They've been crossed throughout history. I mean, I'll give you dozens of examples. I mean, Bill Moyers comes to mind, but that's easy. I mean, Churchill and Teddy Roosevelt come to mind. I mean, even going back to the earliest days of the Republic, I mean, Thomas Jefferson funded a newspaper secretly while he was Secretary of State to attack the foreign policies of his president, which, by the way, is like super not cool, but there it is. Sorry, that's my radiator going off. That is to say that I think that they are always in tension, but they can be complementary and ideally should be motivated by a similar thing. Mentioning Thomas Jefferson, I think, is a reminder that to some extent, partisan press has always been with us. It's ebbed and flowed in different times. I think there's a lot about mid-20th century America that we can learn from. And one of which was that, certainly it wasn't that partisan papers disappeared, but there was an ideal of objectivity. And I say ideal because, pure objectivity is impossible to get at. And even truth itself is a very difficult target. Carl Bernstein says reporting is the best available version of the truth. But I think we can say being fair is vitally important. And that will, I think, lead you towards those two other ideals. We fell away from that for a number of reasons as a society, but one of which is the repeal of what was called the Fairness Doctrine in the late 1980s. Now, it happened under Reagan, but actually Reagan initially opposed it. Up to that point, basically, if you got into political commentary, because much of the airwaves were leased from the federal government, part of the lease was A degree of news is part of a public service component, and that you would have balanced opinions. So you would have a liberal and a conservative when it came to opinions, and therefore news was kept sort of quote unquote down the middle. Now, two things about that. One, conservatives long complained, particularly again in the wake of the civil rights movement, that the liberal media, that the supposedly objective press had a liberal bias. And some conservatives were worried that if the fairness doctrine were repealed, that they would lose their platform. Instead, of course, what happened is it opened up a massive market for right-wing talk radio primarily. And interestingly, you see a decline in the number of music stations. That's almost, I mean, radio was primarily a musical form that had a couple of news channels. Then all of a sudden, right-wing talk radio became entertainment. So you had infotainment, and it was partisan, and it was the same. It was shock jock stuff. And Rush Limbaugh just died, but he, it deserves credit and blame for a lot of what happened to our country. And then, of course, you had Fox News, formed under the slogan "Fair and Balanced" by Roger Ailes, former Nixon aide. But again, that's the reason that's such an insidious slogan is that its real goal was to correct what they saw as implicit bias, liberal bias in the media, with explicit bias, but then pretend it was down the middle. All this ended up being, I think, quite dangerous in the fullness of time, and helped lead to today. I think it normalized the tone of Donald Trump, who is a recognizable figure. Even the founding fathers could have anticipated aspects of Donald Trump. But I think partisan media, explicitly partisan media, that tries to divide to conquer. Sometimes the business model is called cocooning, but it goes for narrow and intense niche audiences that try to keep people addicted to anger and anxiety, bears a lot of responsibility for the divisions in our society. Also because a lot of political figures feel subservient to those folks. And that leads to something. If you cover Congress, or if you have reporters cover Congress, you hear all the time. Congressmen, senators, even senators will say, I would like to vote this way. I know it's the right thing, but I can't do it. And what they're increasingly saying out loud is they're afraid to do it, in some cases for their lives. That's a real sickness in society, and that's something we've got to deal with as a democracy. I totally reject the idea that that most news outlets are de facto partisan and therefore part of the problem. It's a human business, and so obviously everyone's going to make mistakes, and you're going to have lots of people with lots of different opinions. But there are places that exist explicitly as partisan exercises as part of their business model, and there are places that don't. And one of the most insidious things you see in the fights is places that try to, however imperfectly, play it down the middle, being called partisan as a way of legitimizing the people who are explicitly partisan and to try to create a false moral equivalence. It's not true. It's a lie. It's as much a lie as Donald Trump lying and calling, responsible news outlets fake news as a way of delegitimizing them in the eyes of his supporters. But that is just the latest chapter in this really dangerous dynamic that has very much contributed to where we are. Real journalism is the solution to that problem. It is not the problem.
Definitely. And what role do you think has social media played in sort of helping a lot of news outlets with this sort of cocooning and partisanship? And what is the role of social media in that?
Well, helping is kind of a loaded verb there, right?
True.
I mean, look, first of all, I'm bullish on social media to the extent that when I was building the Daily Beast's audience, it was still relatively early within social media, and I intentionally hired people who had social media presences as a way of amplifying our stories, of differentiating our brand, and social media can be a really powerful way of promoting stories, and I don't think it can be ignored. That said, let's bifurcate sort of the one reality check on social media and then a second. One is, and I think this is actually one of the great insights of Joe Biden's campaign, is that he assiduously did not mistake political talk on Twitter for real life. And journalists especially, that tail can wag the dog, and Donald Trump very much benefited from it. And in fact, the problems of trolls and bots, which I think we'll find more and more were outright manipulated, created a sense of normalcy or conflict designed to intimidate people or push positions that probably didn't reflect the way the vast majority of people felt. And indeed, we also saw on the Democratic side of the aisle, I mean, the far left was far louder than it was actually powerful in terms of voting power. But I also think news organizations have a responsibility to engage in social media. Mm-hmm. It is ultimately a question of taste and judgment. You got to know your news organization's brand. You need to give clear guidance to your reporters. I've had issues in the past where reporters got in trouble with certain people, on the business side of an organization, because they'd been perceived as coloring outside the lines. But unless those guidelines are fairly clear and established, I think a sacrificial lamb to prove a point is probably a really bad idea and will lead to totally credible accusations of double standards. I think that one rule I have, and I wrote this down as part of our rules that I wrote at the Beast, is don't feed the trolls. I think some journalists spend way too much time arguing with trolls on social media. That's not a good time. If you're a public figure, it's a good idea to consider turning off your mentions. Say what you have to say, get your message out, be aware that, this is, and for young journalists in particular, don't forget that everything on social media is what your potential employers will look at. So it's not actually a house party account. Like, don't be an idiot, but it can be a great way to develop a brand and a credibility in a narrow focused place of journalism. And therefore people interested in those areas, you can quickly become an authority or an expert if you really focus on that and aggregate that information and add to it with your own original reporting and voice and analysis. It can be a really powerful tool. And I don't think news organizations should be afraid of it, but they need to create a culture in which people are smart, not stupid about it.
That makes sense. What other advice do you have when it comes to covering politics, right? As an editor who's worked and built Daily Beast, what other advice would you have for covering politics, particularly the sort of politics of extremism and fringe politics?
Sure. Well, when I started out doing sort of the extremism beat, the wingnut beat, the freak beat, it really was not very well defined at all. There weren't a lot of reporters. That's not to say no one had covered this stuff before, but it hadn't been seen as a major beat. And indeed, there was a lot of debate about whether I was giving too much attention to these people. And by the way, that's a perfectly reasonable point of view. There's a line there, but my sense was, hey, this is happening. This is actually in the process of taking over a major political party, and understanding what the rhetoric is and that there's something resembling an echo chamber of logic in their hot house conversations can be key to understanding it and trying to counteract it. I think that the rules I would have are, one, make sure you're not just falling into the crazy person says crazy thing trap. That's not news. I was working on a very large essay that I'll still publish at some point, but about what the news media learned from covering Joe McCarthy, and it changed enormously. And there's one or two good books about this, but basically one of the takeaways is that just because a senator says it doesn't mean it's news. And there's a role for analysis. You can't be a stenographer to people in power. This is the inverse to that rule. Crazy person says crazy thing does not necessarily mean it's important. In fact, it probably doesn't. But if somebody has demonstrated influence, if they have a platform with a meaningful number of followers, or hardcore supporters, if it's clearly part of a larger real trend, not a fake trend like the New York Times trying to bring monocles back or something, then it's absolutely worth studying and paying attention to. I would look for data to back it up, although that can be difficult to find if you're very early on a story, but it's not impossible.
Mhm.
You know, around the publishing of Wingnuts, the book, a polling company did a poll that was sort of pegged to it. I wasn't involved, but they were aware the book was coming out. I'd been writing about this stuff, and these issues were percolating. And you know, it found that like a shockingly high percent of Republicans described Democrats as socialists and things like that. At the time, this was super shocking and really controversial. It is neither shocking nor controversial to know that now, but the data was important as a way of quantifying the reporting. And if you can find that, that's important too. The other thing I would try to do when I interviewed people, particularly if they were not public figures, you know, if they were holding a sign at a rally, take a picture of the sign and all that, because they're, you know, in public at a rally. But then I'd go up and say, hey, you know, I'd like to talk to you. Obviously, you know, do all the things you need to do, identify yourself, ask if you can record it. But I really would say, what are you trying to say with this? And including explicitly when people were holding signs comparing Obama to Hitler, right? Now, it goes against a lot of your natural impulses to be like, hey, I really just want to understand, right? But it's actually really important and much more interesting. You know, one of the things that, and go try to find the column by Murray Kempton called The Southern Gentleman. He interviews he's not literally a Klan leader, but he effectively is in Louisiana in the early 1960s. And the first line is sort of like his I believe is literally, his grandchildren call him Pop Pop, and he's almost totally impossible to dislike. And then he interviews him, and the guy, he lets him hang himself. He's like an admirer of South Africa. He thinks apartheid's great, and we've got a lot to learn from it. And by the end, he's like, well, you know, I don't know, maybe you give me a lot to think about, you know, maybe I'm, you know, but you know, letting people talk and tell their story. And what I found in talking to these people was actually really interesting. One thing I would hear from those folks is, well, they called Bush Hitler and nobody said it, complained, so I figured it was all right. So already the feedback loop between perceived extremes, which is often artificial and ginned up, was very real to them, and that's something to be aware of, and as citizens as well as journalists. Another thing I heard constantly, and remember, the Tea Party movement was allegedly at the time about you know, it was a calling out of both parties for an abandonment of fiscal responsibility, right? They taxed enough already, and they wanted to reduce the deficit and the debt. History, I think, has shown that was not really what was going on several levels. But in talking to some of these people with some of the more extreme signs, the other thing I heard a lot was I think the date 2045 or 2055. Which was at the time the US Census estimate for when America would become quote unquote majority minority. And the other thing I'd heard him say is, my family's been here for blank generations, 7 generations. And it expressed what was not really showing up in polling or analysis much at the time. There was a deep anxiety about cultural change, about demographic change, and a sense of some folks whose families had been here for a long time, that they were getting left behind. And so Obama was an avatar for their economic and cultural anxiety. Now, I don't want to dress it up too much, but that's was happening. And so I had a chapter in the book called The Birth of White Identity Politics. Mm-hmm. And I think that clearly has been borne out as a major focus in our politics. But at the time, it was really embryonic. But it wouldn't have been so clear if I hadn't taken the time to talk to those people to try to figure out what they were trying to say. But you could, you know, I'm not trying to say dignify the crazy, but treat people as human beings and you'll learn more.
Definitely. And I wanted to talk about going back to the politics of it and moving this like a little from reporting, and just what do you foresee based on your vast knowledge of history? What do you foresee happening next now that Donald Trump is out of the office? Do you see an abatement of this sort of extremist politics, or what do you?
I am, as you know, an evangelist about the importance of using history, combining history and politics to create current context around current events.
Mhm.
Uh, I think it's interesting. I think it's fascinating. I think it's an underutilized move in journalism and analysis. Um, but I want to be real cautious about whether that gives you the ability to see into the future with any great accuracy. Um, some things are clear, right? I mean, this too shall pass. That's you want to make a very safe bet. Put your money on this too shall pass. Um, Demagogues ultimately implode, and cults always look bad in the rearview mirror, and lots of other things. But the radius of damage can be quite large at any given time, and sometimes American history can, hang on a hair. I mean, if the election of 1864 went a different way, if there are certain elections and certainly certain assassinations that definitely changed the course of American history. What we see is that the Republican Party is still very much enthralled to Donald Trump, and that it is approaching something that certainly resembles a cult of personality um, in a classical sense. Um, to the extent that people are trying to find ways to back up the big lie just solely so they feel like they can tap into his supporters. And it's enormously important to call that out because it's incredibly dangerous. And you can see this again in polling, a belief that, Donald Trump actually won. He did not, and all this other stuff. Or that, Antifa attacked the Capitol. And this is being stirred by some members of Congress, or with false equivalencies, whataboutism and all those things. History also shows that political parties can often be changed by whoever is at the top. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, polarization and hyperpartisanship created this. In the latest Gallup poll, self-identified independent voters are 50%. Now that'll fluctuate. But, as the Republican Party has really jettisoned its center right purposely, it left it much more susceptible to a hostile takeover from someone like Donald Trump, who didn't actually represent ideology at all, right? Mm-hmm. So all of which is to say that, but America is instinctively still a center-right country, and there's lots of different ways to analyze that, and progressives will look at it and say, well, on policies it's not fair enough, but I think as we've seen that people don't vote on policies as much as emotion and identity. And I do think we need sort of a recalibration and a recentering as a country. But it's clear, I mean, just the composition of the US Senate is set up in such a way that, the center right is always going to have a really good shot at winning. And the far left is probably not going to have such a good shot demographically. And things will evolve over time, but that's been the nature of our democracy. Now, of course, there's nothing particularly center right about Donald Trump as it's classically understood. But we see he did very well when districts in Miami, for example, where socialism seemed to be on the ballot, and you had a significant number of voters who had experiences with communism and socialism in their own lives, and that was a very powerful, I may not like this, but at least he's not that, even if it has nothing to do with the actual debate. So look, our country is very divided and very fractured politically. We have been more fractured before, obviously. We survived the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, was our greatest president, and he was bookended by objectively our two worst, James Buchanan and Andrew Johnson. And the Republic still survived. We need to take responsibility as citizens and as journalists for trying to heal the breach. That means, among other things, I think elevating civic education again, and trying not to inflame divides other than to confront lies. We need to insist on a fact-based debate, particularly as journalists, and we should never apologize for that. And look, debating with conspiracy theorists is probably not a good use of anybody's time. But this is a real serious problem that's rooted in we have a common responsibility, citizens, journalists, I think, to defend liberal democracy, lowercase l, lowercase d. And we should take that really seriously. Um, I absolutely believe that we will emerge from all of this eventually stronger, but we should take none of it for granted. And I think one of the lessons of the era we just came through is the enormous danger that can occur in democracies when large numbers of people disengage, or they feel that it's really fashionable to be cynical and detached from a process and think it doesn't matter, man. It all matters a lot. And as you look at the curve of the 21st century, we see the rise of a lot of ethno-nationalist parties and autocracies. And they will be challenging and are challenging the United States and liberal democracy, lowercase l, lowercase d, as a system of governance around the world. And if you care about freedoms, civil liberties, civil rights, I don't know that you should not be neutral in that particular contest of ideas. And so I do think, therefore, at least my feeling has always been, we should try to offer solutions as well as criticisms as journalists as well, implicitly or explicitly.
So that's so one of the things I was thinking about. So you've written about in Independent Nation, you've written about centrists and independents, and I was wondering what role independents or centrists can play in the hyper-partisan politics of our time in bringing sort of.
Sure. Look, I'd say that first of all, independence, the growth of independent voters to me is clearly not incidental, and that's part of the point of the book I made. That book is 15 years old now, which makes me feel old. I was young when I wrote it, but still. And what I was trying to do there is to show that there was kind of a secret history of American politics that didn't follow narrowly along the lines of left or right or Democrat or Republican. And that many of our best leaders have been centrist, but not all. And it's also interesting to know how those folks fail. But the rise of independent voters is clearly a reaction to the perceived polarization of the two parties. Although it's a bell curve, and you've got some folks on the far right in the independent thing and some folks on the far left. But for example, the whole liberal Republican tradition in the Northeast, like where you are, Charlie Baker, your current governor, accepted, and Phil Scott, who are, by the way, two of the most popular governors in the country, most of those folks de-aligned into independent voters. But the fact that Democrats are split evenly between moderates and liberals, and moderates in the Republican Party are like basically been hunted out of existence. Like technically, they're still a quarter or less, probably more like 15%. But I do think that a functioning government does depend on a strong center, just like a functioning democracy, I think, depends on a strong middle class. And I think that's been allowed to winnow away. And that's really been very destabilizing for our society. And so I do think that, more centrists getting engaged, the political parties becoming less polarized because of their engagement. I think things like redistricting reform and open primaries can help enormously. Ranked choice voting can help. But I mean, all these attempts to rig elections to empower the extremes are really the root of the problem. It's an incentive structure problem. And that's one of the reasons that so many members of Congress act the way they do, afraid. So I think there's clearly major realignments occurring in politics. That's not a question. I think the two-party system as it exists doesn't actually is not representative of where most Americans are, to put it mildly. But right now, it's a real question whether we have two functioning political parties. It's in a sane, rational political party. Charlie Baker, Republican from Massachusetts, would be, a logical candidate to run for president. And yet, even Charlie Baker doesn't think he could ever become president or win the Republican nomination. And that's a problem, right? I mean, typically, a hugely popular Republican governor of Massachusetts should be a great national candidate, right? But that's a sign of how it's broken. So I do think there are going to be increasing opportunities, but I think we desperately need election reform. And it's really important for those folks, particularly the non-screamers and the non-shouters, to be passionately engaged in American politics, just to provide some ballast against the crazies.
Definitely. Oh, we have some great questions coming
Right.
up. even
Sure.
better than me already. So SPJ leaders, I don't know who is on
How
the
will the
host,
death of Rush Limbaugh impact the right-wing echo chamber? Well, I mean, obviously he was um, a large and defining figure in the right-wing talk radio ecosystem. And to some extent, and someone wrote a good piece about this the other day, he established kind of a model that Donald Trump rose to the presidency. It was slash and burn, brash, never apologize, demonize, divide. When called on stuff, say it's a joke, and people don't just have a sense of humor, but you're really tapping into, obviously bigger stuff. He made a lot of money, and I do think his impact on politics and media was significant in terms of, I think, disfiguring, from my perspective, a lot of national debate. And I do think it's important. Here's another role where history can play a constructive role as the dust clears, because it's important to try to, even though he often celebrated when his political opponents died, um, uh, you know, I do think it's important to take a look at how some of his bits aged, and in a decent interval, just because of his influence. Because that's another way that I think understanding a lot of the things that happen with extremists, particularly in talk radio, is it goes out into the ether. It has an impact, but it's never captured. And but from his bits around the AIDS crisis to other things, I think that stuff's revealing, just in the way that National Review is a responsible conservative publication in many respects. But if you go back and look at their defense of segregation in the 1950s, that's a really important document for understanding where some of these folks were coming from. Even ones who evolved, like James Kilpatrick, go read his stuff, and you'll see there were a lot of people who were self-identified conservatives arguing against the civil rights movement, arguing against, for segregation in effect. And that cannot and should not be forgotten. It's important understanding the antecedents of these arguments. Anyway, what else?
Adam Sanat, who was kind enough to allow me to host this,
Adam,
are there any wingnut voices on the left that you're concerned about? And how come the right-wing wingnuts are often more impactful than the left-wing wingnuts?
well, first of all, because we have asymmetric polarization in our country. I mean, I can say and I can believe that the far right can be as just crazy as far left, but the reality is that in my adult life, the far right has been far more powerful, like in every way, particularly where it counts in Congress. And that's to some extent, the left carries baggage to do with perceived cultural excesses that can be like something some random college professor says or does somewhere that really should carry no weight in any national political debate. And that's an additional burden. I think it's important to understand the feedback loop between the extremes. When, for example, San Francisco, they backtracked, but decided they were going to remove every president's name from every school in San Francisco, not just Washington and Jefferson, but Abraham Lincoln, and on and on and on. I was like, these guys are giving an in-kind contribution to the Republican National Committee. I mean, it's all they're doing. Now, there's a double irony, because obviously it's conservatives who've argued for local school board control, and they're demonizing this. But in any case, I think it's important to understand the extremes. I think there have been times where you have the perception, and certainly instances where folks on the left with major media platforms can say things that approach the incendiary nature of the right, and it's important to call out the far. You got to use the same standards, but I have seen, for example, there's a chapter on Keith Olbermann in my book, and Keith Olbermann at the time was sort of the most prominent liberal polemicist on television. Now, he's a very different guy. I mean, I wouldn't put him in the same sentence as Rush Limbaugh, but he was seen by some as like a counterweight to Glenn Beck, let's say. Now, Keith actually would play up his provocateur, he named me the worst person in the world once for something, mostly I think for putting it in my book, but he didn't cop to that. It was something else. But, and he definitely, I detail a number of instances where he clearly, went way over the line. But, Keith actually would try to make sure that everything that he said was fact checked. That's not necessarily a discipline that you see on his corollaries on the right. In fact, fascinatingly, Fox News actually argued in court under a defamation suit that none of their viewers, particularly those watching the Tucker Carlson show, which was the incident in this case, expected to be told the truth. That was their legal defense in court. And, that they didn't assume that things that were being called facts were in fact facts. That's dangerous and strange. And by the way, attempts to create left-wing talk radio like Air America did not succeed. They have never really succeeded. And something for folks to remember is that if you look at, the number of self-identified liberals in the country tends to be roughly half, tens, of self-identified conservatives. And then if you divide liberals into very liberal and like just liberal, and I guess, we don't generally poll for socialists, except it's like a fifth of the Democratic Party. So there's also a receivable audience issue, at least if you're going for mass media, that may account for the disproportionate influence and power. What else?
He also asks about should we bring back the fairness doctrine?
Yeah, man, that's a tough one. I tend to think that it's difficult, if not impossible, to put that genie back in the bottle. That said, it existed for a long time and presumably would be considered constitutional. I think, however, it was largely in the context of federally leased airwaves. I'm not sure how that applies to media today. I also think it's a very difficult thing to quote unquote police. It was somewhat possible in the context of basically 3 broadcasting companies and a half-hour news programs. So as a practical matter, I'm not sure how you do it. That said, we should look quite intensely, not thinking that the post-war period was anything resembling perfect. Perfect's not on the menu, ever. But there was a period of remarkable, there were deep disagreements, but there was a degree of stability in our politics at a time when America was rising in the world. There are economic factors in this. There's generational factors. You had a generation in Congress that, yes, disproportionately white to be sure, but they had gone through the Great Depression and World War II. They'd served in the military together, and therefore they had a common language and common experiences across partisan and regional lines. You had a really strong and growing middle class, and you had the Fairness Doctrine. You had a lot of things that created a more stable, constructive political conversation and climate. And it's worth figuring out what macro factors we can learn from and which we should not. But the Fairness Doctrine, I think, is the break glass scenario, and I have a lot of questions about its practicality and its applicability. But things have certainly gone off the rails since.
Folks are welcome to come up with more questions, or I can ask more.
Go ahead. Got a few more.
So one of the things I was recently reading about, George Washington University recently came out with a report on the January 6th insurrection on the US Capitol, and about over half of the people who were charged for taking part in that were not connected to any extremists, like no knowable extremist groups or to even one another. They were usually a part, the university report said that they were usually a part of the conspiracy communities online. And I was wondering if you could expand on like how the conspiracy communities fit into your idea of like Wingnuts and where they would fit.
Just so I'm following you, are you talking about like QAnon?
And it wasn't even QAnon. Like they were like, these were like people who did not actually, were not exactly identifying with any of these groups, but these were people who just took part because they were aggravated with what they saw online or read online, or these conspiracy theories that they read online. So the
Well,
report called them conspiracy communities.
well, I don't want to comment on something I didn't read, but obviously conspiracy theories have reached a mainstreaming largely because of the influence of online and social media that it didn't have before. And I think here's where the enormous aggregating power of the internet and social media becomes so powerful. It's not that we didn't have plenty of conspiracy theorists in America before, but they were all sort of inherently isolated.
Mhm.
You and all of a sudden they have the ability to really connect over vast distances and amplify. Some cases artificially amplified. And I think we'll find some of this stuff has been artificially amplified, by the way. But and then we've never had a president who actually fanned the flames. I mean, a president who refuses to denounce QAnon. In fact, gives dog whistles to them. That's a very different environment than we've ever had before. Um, but obviously, the role of conspiracy theories in the fringes of politics um, can be powerful. It's obviously sort of morally disfiguring, but it's really important. I hope, if anything, if you're covering these extremist groups, it's both more interesting and it's really important to try to understand these people as people,
Mhm.
and to not lose a sense of their humanity. It'll make for better copy. It'll make for more insightful um, you know read, and then you can begin to figure out how to you know talk to people in a way that can help restore some civility again without coddling conspiracy theories, because we shouldn't do that. That's not our job. Again, it's a fact-based debate, but understanding where people are coming from, and sometimes it's a matter of people hearing themselves, being asked respectfully and civilly some questions that actually forcing them to confront the contradictions between their self-image and professed values and what they seem to be saying or backing now can actually be a really important technique. I mean, it can be a revelatory moment in an interview, but it's sort of a classic process for jarring somebody out of uh, these situations. Um, but I do think approaching politics, approaching journalism from an explicitly
Mhm.
politically or ideological point of view is not helpful.
Mhm.
Uh, but keeping everything on a human scale is. And again, our primary question should be: is it true or not? And are we being fair? Is really important too, and that includes the people we're covering, obviously.
I am. Oh, I get one more question, and so one of the other things that I was thinking about was there's this sort of like, and this is one of those underreported parts as someone who reports a lot more on gender and politics. One of the things you see is that in many cases of like these violent cases of political extremism, men are often more culpable to these instances of violence. And so, for example, with the January siege, I think men outnumbered women 6-1. So would you say there is a relationship, and I don't know, is there a relationship between gender and political extremism?
Um, well, uh, I think you can certainly say that young men have been traditionally more militarized and militarizable than
Mhm.
women in general. On the other hand, I want to really emphasize the in general. Um, it's true, for example, in the realm of terrorism, that we don't often find female terrorists.
Mhm.
Um, it's not never the case, though.
True.
And I've been really struck by how many women took place in the attack on the Capitol.
Mhm.
I don't know. I haven't seen the statistics in that gendered breakdown. 6-1 seems probably a little overweighted to me. But the fact that even if 20% of the people who attack the Capitol are women, that's actually itself sort of stunning.
Definitely.
I don't know, for example, how QAnon supporters break down by gender. But so I try really hard, however imperfectly, at sort of doing the individual first analysis, because I think it's both more true and more interesting. And indeed, I think, while you can draw conclusions from broad demographic trends, if you look at a rally audience and it's 96% white, well, then you can, that doesn't mean you should erase the presence of the 4% non-white. And indeed, their stories may be more interesting and more compelling. So both things can be true. You can describe it as an almost all white audience, but the presence of the non-white folks in a particular crowd may be more compelling. Particularly, though, I think you need to be careful of like the old game that some groups will play, is to like put them in a camera shot to over-index the representativeness. As it relates to gender, though, particularly with the Capitol Hill riot, I mean, I'm just looking at like right now one of the apparent leaders of the Oath Keepers who was arrested at the riot is a woman, and I think that's really interesting, because that would not typically be the profile one would expect. And yet, we saw a mother and son arrested. So there are all sorts of really interesting and I think complicated dynamics that at the end of the day, they're all individual stories and they need to be understood individually. And as much as humanly possible, I think getting away from group analysis or group blame is what I prefer to see, because I think it's both more true and more respectful and more interesting.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Anyway, my pleasure.
I have run out of time to ask my
Okay.
questions.
I'm going to get back to writing my reality check.
This was really, really insightful and helpful.
I appreciate that. I hope so. I hope it wasn't terrible. I hope something redeemable comes out of it, something useful.
Definitely something very useful.
Good.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who was there. All right. Take care.